Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Heritage Voices, episode 21. I'm Jessica Yaquinto, and I'll be your host today. And today we are talking about food sovereignty and natives outdoors. Before we begin, I'd like to honor and acknowledge the Nooch or Ute peoples on whose treaty lands I am recording today, as well as the other tribes with ancestral and cultural connections to this land. Okay, so today we have Ashleigh Thompson on the show, and Ashleigh is going to introduce herself.
Nin Buju, Ashleigh Nandijnakas, Migizian Dodem, Miskwaagamiiwi-zaaga'igan, and Donjeba. Hello, I'm Ashleigh. I am of the Eagle clan, and I am an enrolled member of the Red Lake Ojibwe, which is a tribe in northern Minnesota. This fall I'll be starting my fourth year of my PhD program at the University of Arizona. I'm getting a PhD in anthropology with a concentration in archaeology. And right now I am currently finished with classes. I'm writing my master's thesis because I did not get a master's before I entered my PhD program. And so I'm working on a collaborative project with my tribe, the Red Lake Ojibwe, on food sovereignty, historically and contemporarily focused. I'm using the archaeological record, the historical record, and then a big part of my thesis is doing interviews with elders in my community, as well as just knowledgeable people or people that work with local foods. And yeah, that's basically me in a nutshell.
All right, so just to get us started, do you want to first talk a little bit about how did you come to all of this?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think it would be best to start, as an undergraduate student or even before that. So a little bit of my personal history is I was originally born in Minneapolis in the city, and my mother is from the reservation from Red Lake. And when I was a young kid, I lived with her, and then and my dad, who is not native, he's a white man. Because of their struggles with addiction, my brother and I ended up in foster care when we were very young in the Twin Cities, and then we were later taken in by my dad's mom, my grandmother, who at the time when I was about 4, she was living in Salt Lake City, Utah. And so at a young age, I moved away from Anishinaabe people and over to Utah to be raised by my white grandmother. And so for college, I returned to Minnesota, and I went to the University of Minnesota Morris, which is a smaller campus of the University of Minnesota. And I went into school as an environmental science major. At that time, I was, and I still am, an advocate for environmental protection. And by chance, I took a class that was taught by a Métis anthropologist, Julie Pelletier. And it was one of those required classes all freshmen had to take, and we could just choose a topic that was interesting to us. And so she was doing representations of Native Americans in popular culture. And so I ended up in her freshman seminar class, and I loved her perspective as a Native woman. I'd never experienced that in school, being taught by a Native person or even a Native lady. So it was that class that I just kind of wound up in by accident that my interests in American Indian studies and anthropology and archaeology, where I first experienced those interests. And so for my general education requirements throughout my first couple of years, I kept being drawn back to American Indian Studies classes and anthropology classes taught by Native faculty. And I ended up switching my major to anthropology. And so I actually graduated from University of Minnesota with 4 majors. Yeah. Yeah. So anthropology, American Indian Studies, English, and multicultural studies.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I can't say that in the middle of undergrad I knew I would be in a PhD program for archaeology, but I definitely knew I wanted to work with Native people, and that learning about Indigenous people from Indigenous perspectives was something that was really exciting to me and also very valuable. And not only was I learning stuff that a lot of us aren't taught in our public education systems about, like, actual United States Native American relations and the history and contemporary issues and stuff like that. So I just essentially towards the end of my college career, I was unsure, and that's kind of why I did several different majors. And then I took some time off before graduate school and did AmeriCorps and applied to anthropology PhD programs, and that's how I ended up in this field. So,
what did you do your AmeriCorps in?
Yeah, I did Minnesota Reading Corps, which I was a preschool literacy tutor. So I was teaching sort of literacy basics to preschoolers to help them be ready for kindergarten, because research shows that children that have an early start at those concepts do better, not just in like kindergarten, elementary school, but in school the rest, like all the way through college. So I was a literacy tutor for a year in Minnesota.
So then so you did undergrad, got into anthropology, you did an AmeriCorps, and then what made you decide that archaeology specifically was the way that you wanted to go?
I ended up taking an archaeology class, and I knew it was something that sounded interesting to me because I've always loved field work. I'd done some environmental or ecology research projects my first couple years as an undergraduate student, where we were out in the field, like collecting samples. And so I had never done any archaeology, but I took an archaeology class. And then some of my mentors at University of Minnesota Morris recommended I do a field school if it were something that I was truly interested in pursuing, a career that I really wanted. And so I did my field school through University of Alaska Fairbanks, and it was just like about 2 months outside, about an hour or 2 outside of Fairbanks, on this Paleo Indian site called the Mead site, which at its oldest is dated about 13,000 years old. So that was my first hands-on experience with archaeology, and I really, really enjoyed that. And it was also when I started getting into archaeology that I realized there was oftentimes lack of Indigenous voices in archaeology and anthropology. So after field school the next summer, I did an RU, which is a research experience for undergraduates, funded through the National Science Foundation, and I worked not in Alaska, but I worked in Indiana at Angel Mounds, and that's a middle Mississippian site. And there I got, more excavation experience, and then also there's a lab component of that too, where we got to work at Indiana, or the University of Indiana. And then I also did a Minnesota Historical Society Museum Fellowship, which was geared specifically for young Native students. And we got for 2 weeks, the Minnesota Historical Society took us to these sites around Minnesota that had to do with Indigenous history. And we were able to dissect the interpretations at those sites and talk about sort of, what was working well for us as young Native people and what we would like to see change. And so I would say it was, those 3 hands-on experiences that really pushed me into archaeology and made me realize, like, one, I'm really interested in the field. I really enjoy learning about Native history. And then also I just felt that it was a really good discipline for a Native woman, because I think we need more Native scholars in anthropology and these sorts of fields where we can tell our own stories, which so often have been told by non-Natives.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting, those are 3, and then now you're at the University of Arizona. So 4 very different places, like very different, looking at Tucson and Alaska, for example.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting aspect. And then also, I'd also be interested in hearing more about what kind of conclusions you guys reached about the interpretation and what maybe you recommended to Minnesota about the interpretation and how you'd like to see it.
Right. Starting with your that second question about what us as Native people, we liked what we saw. We really appreciated when either the state archaeologists or the museum professionals or the people at these sites, we were really appreciative when they offered a Native version of events rather than the United States version of events, or like the U.S. military's perspective of an event. And so, like, one of the sites that we visited was Fort Snelling, which is the site of where, after the U.S. Dakota War, hundreds of Dakota people were basically held there, and in the end, that conflict resulted in the largest mass hanging in United States history, ordered by President Lincoln. So, for a site like that, with lots of different perspectives of settler and tribal conflicts and land encroachment and stuff like that, it was refreshing when we could see actual either Native American quotes of what happened. It was great if we could even meet with, I don't think at that site in particular at that time there was one, but like if opportunity was there for like an actual Native person to be hired to tell those stories to the public. And so, yeah, basically our recommendations was like to be fair and give, Native people a voice when possible, and also just to like make an effort to do so is really important too, because I mean you can't always hire Native people in these sorts of positions, but when professionals are able to make an effort to at least include how Indigenous voices when they can is, I don't know, what we like to see, what seemed to work best at the sites we visited. And then we were sad when we would visit, or we weren't sad, we were just like either different emotions, but like annoyed or irritated or sad when Indigenous voices were left out of history. So yeah. And what was the first question that you asked?
I guess it wasn't so much a question as an observation of, wow, those are 4 very different places.
Oh, yeah. So how did I end up? Yeah, so like when I went to field school, I really didn't have any idea of where I wanted to work except that I wanted to work with Native people. And I was a recipient of the Society for American Archaeology. They have a scholarship for Native American students, a field school scholarship. And so I was a recipient of that. So I was able to sort of, choose a field school that I might not otherwise be able to go to. So that first field experience was just basically me going, where would it be cool to go for a summer and dig? And I ended up going up to Alaska and working on a really old site, which was, just sounded really like a neat experience. And then the next summer, I just was looking for any research experience I could, and that this research program for undergrads had presented itself. So that's how I ended up in the Midwest on an excavation. But then I chose the program I'm in now because there's several faculty at the University of Arizona that have had experiences working with Indigenous peoples. And my advisor in particular had a lot of experience working with tribes from all over the United States. And so that's what drew me here. And I've worked with her on the Blackfeet Nation excavating. I excavated like the last 2 summers with her and a Blackfeet crew and some other people from University of Arizona. And then I've also worked with another anthropologist, archaeologist here at University of Arizona on ethnographic project with actually a couple different ones, but with the Apache people. And one is, it's done, but what we were doing, which ties into my bigger goal of making Indigenous voices heard, is the National Park Service hired us to get the Indigenous side of the history at Fort Bowie, which is a National Historic Site in southeastern Arizona. It's a fort that was active during the late 1800s, and it's where Geronimo was finally brought and captured. And so what that site wanted was less of the U.S. military perspective and more of the Inde or the Chiricahua Apache perspective. So that was a really neat project where I got to travel to some different Apache reservations, including the Yavapai Apache Nation, the White Mountains, and Mescalero Apache Reservation to conduct interviews with elders and gain their oral histories of the history of southeastern Arizona and the Chiricahua Apache people there. And so through all of these experiences I've had where I've worked all over the country, it's these experiences where I've been working with tribes that I found have been the most fulfilling for me and for, it seems like the projects that have had the biggest impact are the ones that, are collaborative in nature with tribes. And so for my thesis project, I really, going to school in the Southwest, I've been taken away from Anishinaabe land, and I was really missing the land and, the opportunities to be involved in cultural things and to learn my language when I moved to Tucson. And so the thesis project, I went to our THPO, our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and told them I wanted to do a project with the Red Lake as a means to stay connected up there. But also for our tribe, we only have one archaeologist. And so there's a lot of research potential in Red Lake. And then I also love research that is applied. I love applied research. So I wanted my project to not just be meaningful to me, but I wanted it to be meaningful to the Indigenous community I would be working with. And so I approached our archaeologist and I said, I'm really open to any project really. Where could you guys use some help, or where's some research that you guys would like to see get done? And so what they suggested to me was a food sovereignty project. So a little information about food sovereignty, because I'm sure not everybody really completely understands what that is.
So we are actually already at our first breakpoint.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Okay, so right at the end of the last segment there, you started telling us about your research at Red Lake. And could you start out by telling our listeners what exactly food sovereignty is?
Yeah, sure. So specifically for American Indians in the United States, a lot of our communities are on reservations, which are oftentimes low-income communities. They're oftentimes remote communities away from big urban areas. And so what's happened is a lot of reservations have become food islands, where it's really difficult for people that live on the reservation to get that whole, fresh, healthy food that is available to, a lot of other people that live in areas where that sort of food is accessible to them. And so, and then because of events in the past and also contemporarily, so for example, when tribes were given food rations and then later, commodity foods, lots of these foods were not part of our quote unquote traditional diet. There's, fat and white flour and stuff like that, which has contributed to a lot of the health problems Native Americans face that are related to diet, such as heart disease, obesity, diabetes. And so a lot of Native communities are, for one, trying to return to traditional foods. So people have different definitions of what a traditional food is, but essentially what foods that we consumed prior to colonization and prior to these introduced foods, from outside of our traditional diet that have caused these health-related problems. So a lot of tribes are, trying to get back into our indigenous foods and then to help health in our communities again. And so food sovereignty, indigenous food sovereignty, is how I interpret it, is the ability for a tribe to feed itself, and not just like feed itself unhealthy foods, but feed itself and keep their people healthy. So for this project with my tribe, what our tribal archaeologist recommended was a comprehensive food project that has not been done at Red Lake. There's definitely information out there on what traditional Ojibwe foods are and stuff, but particularly a history of food at Red Lake has never been done. And so a component of my thesis is to do sort of this historical background where I research what's already been done and, tell that story. But then also the other component is to interview living people and elders and people that work with local and traditional foods to document what they have to share about what Red Lake traditional foods are and how they would like to see those foods again, and their ideas and how. And then also another component of the thesis is how are these, like, for indigenous people, food is often, it's more than just something we eat to give us energy to live. It's a lot of food has cultural significance or is in different traditional stories. So also just documenting the cultural importance of food. And for Ojibwe, like a lot of our traditional foods, a lot of people think wild rice or monamin. We have the sugar bush where we tap maple sugar trees in the spring. Ricing is done in the fall. In the summer, there's fishing and harvesting of berries. And then we also hunt. And so, and then at Red Lake, there's actually a long history of, since the Ojibwe came to Red Lake, of us being agriculturalists and actually planting our own gardens and growing things like squash and potatoes and stuff like that. So that's my thesis in a nutshell. And there's different programs at Red Lake that work to give our tribal members access to locally grown healthy food. And so this just helps contribute to those sorts of projects.
Mm-hmm. So is there like a deliverable specifically for the community that you're hoping to turn this into or something like that?
Yeah, so I guess the archaeologist and another person that works with him, the deliverable that they think is really significant is me sitting down and recording these interviews with elders. Mm-hmm. So that's one big part of it. And then to also, Red Lake holds a food summit every fall. And so it's a hope. We're hoping that I'll, by that time be able to present what I've learned with the community. And then just have it for our archives and for our TIPO office.
Awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that it will also, and then there's other, like I said, there's some projects going on. So we have a program that right now they have for the summer have already given away 400 garden packages to community members and have offered like a tilling service to till a part of their yard so that they can, if they're interested, can grow their own food. And so this is just providing more information for projects like that.
Mm-hmm. Is there, so have you've already started the interviews? Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Is there something from those interviews so far that's like either really stood out to you or that you've been really excited about or, something unexpected maybe?
Yeah. So I've basically this summer I have 2 fieldwork trips and I did one already to go to Red Lake, and I have another one coming up in a few weeks to go back and interview some more people. But things that have stood out to me are the diversity of food knowledge, because, people think of us as wild ricers or maple sugar bushers or whatever, but even like talking to people that, for example, one of the people that's considered like an expert on local foods, he was saying just like in the grand scheme of things, how much there is to know and how he's, even as an older person and who has worked with food for decades, is still learning. And so that has stood out to me. Another cool thing is, like people think of historically as the Ojibwe as sort of like hunter-gatherers or people that followed the seasonal round, which is true. But, Ojibwe came to Red Lake and they are actually agriculturists. And there's a documented history of when there was a bad year for wild rice and a lot of the other Ojibwe communities in Minnesota didn't harvest enough wild rice to make it through the winter. Red Lake Ojibwe people had storage of food from not food they'd gathered, but food they'd planted and tended to and were, agriculturists for. And that kept, so people came to Red Lake and were able to rely on our food that we had grown when there was a bad year for wild rice. Mm-hmm. So that's also really interesting and is sort of like a part of indigenous food that you don't typically hear about, that agricultural aspect.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of the time people get kind of labeled as one thing or another, but I mean, honestly, people are a lot more complex than that. And,
Yep.
people are adaptive and they adjust to situations. And, it's not so simple as, these people are hunter-gatherer, wild rice people, and these people are corn farmers, and that's all that they are on either side. I mean, obviously, that's just an oversimplification.
Yeah, it definitely is. And like talking to one of the elders, I asked him, well, what kind of birds would you guys hunt? And he basically said anything we could.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's like there's a lot of food resources out there, and indigenous people are innovative and have been taking advantage of all sorts of food forever. So
right, and they adapt to their landscape because that's what you have to do. And so it's kind of odd that nowadays there's this perspective of like basically that farming is better, or you know what I mean? Like people kind of like look at farming tribes, I feel like a lot of times as like, oh, they're more civilized or whatever.
Oh,
but
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that doesn't, that has more to do with a lot of other factors, and it's just kind of this like I don't know, it's so arbitrary, like, oh, these tribes are
they were sedentary farmers,
and therefore it's a lot more complicated than that. And like I don't know who decided all of a sudden that farming is a good thing and hunting and gathering is a bad thing, or you know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, I do know it was colonialism, but yes. Sorry. So okay, off my soapbox. I'm really curious. You mentioned, you grew up in Utah. You didn't really have as much of an opportunity as you would have liked to be part of the Red Lake community growing up. And you mentioned also learning your language now as an adult. Can you, if you feel comfortable, talk a little bit about what those experiences have been like coming back as an adult and trying to now learn a lot of these aspects?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because I think it's really important to who I am as a scholar. So yeah, growing up, I was not really that involved in my community because I was raised away from Minnesota and Red Lake and away from that side of my family. And so it was really great when I went to college and I had an opportunity to take American Indian Studies courses where I learned about one of the most important things I learned about was historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. And so when I learned about, first of all, the genocide that took place against Indigenous Americans, and then the assimilation policies where Native peoples were forcibly removed from, their homes and their communities to attend very Eurocentric boarding schools, and how that and then several of our community members, were abused in boarding school, and then that abuse and then contributed to, addiction, and then that contributed to intergenerational trauma. And so knowing the history of Native America, it was not only me learning about Native peoples, but understanding my family and my community so much better. And so I was able to, look at my family history and my personal history of having to be in the foster care system, and then later having to be raised by my grandparents. And then later as an adult realizing that is so common for so many American Indians, to have sort of these addictions and traumas in our families. And so it was really actually very healing for me to learn about these histories and these contemporary problems. And then, so not only was I understanding a lot of our tribal, cultural, and familial history, I was able also, as an undergraduate student when I returned to Minnesota, to take Ojibwe language courses at my college. And then I was able to take, I took Anishinaabe song and dance class. And then I started going up to Red Lake, for our powwows. And then I started making friends that were from Red Lake that I didn't know before college because I didn't grow up there. But so I started returning to the reservation a lot more as a young adult and started going to ceremonies. So that was also a very, and it continues to be a process of healing. And I'm so grateful that I went back there for college and that I was able to learn and I'm still learning as much as I can about my tribe, and then that means therefore me and my family. And so having opportunity to do my thesis with Red Lake has been really fulfilling, not just academically or for the tribe, but also on a personal level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I can actually totally relate to a lot of what you just said. I mean, this podcast isn't about me, but yeah, with the historical trauma stuff, I definitely feel like there was, I had kind of a similar moment, just, there's a lot of the same issues within the Jewish community, especially with within families that are Holocaust survivors. And that definitely, in college and in grad school, reading about a lot of that helped me understand better. Same thing, about my family and the addiction and stuff like that. So yeah, I can definitely relate.
Right.
So let's see, we have about a minute and a half until the next break. So maybe could you talk just a little bit more, real brief, about specifically the language aspect and what that's been like learning as an adult? And
yeah, definitely. So at the university, I was taught by Gabe DeRozier. He is a fluent speaker. Ojibwe was his first language. And so when you learn your tribe's language, you begin to think, I think, more like a tribal member. You gain cultural understanding that you wouldn't understand otherwise. I'm trying to think of a concrete example. You get a worldview that isn't conveyed in English the same. Robin Kemmerer, she's a Potawatomi botanist. She wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass. I really enjoyed reading what she had to say about language because she put to words what I've felt. And so one thing I'm thinking of right now is, she says something like 70% of the vocabulary of English is noun based. But for Potawatomi, 70% is verb. The words are verbs and verb based. Instead of being things, they're not just things. They're in the process of doing something. And I think that says a lot about Indigenous worldview of everything is alive and everything is connected. And the Potawatomi and Ojibwe are very similar languages. And so I'm pretty sure you can just apply that straight to Ojibwe. And I've heard similar things about, you can't truly understand a tribe or a culture until you know the language and can see the world through that language.
Absolutely. Okay. So we're at our second break and we will take a break real quick and then jump right back on.
Back back-to-school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop the latest school styles with an extra 25% off during Tanger Style, our biggest sale of the season, now through August 25th. Plan your trip at tanger.com.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Okay, and we are back for the last segment today. So I could definitely talk about all of that a lot longer, but I kind of want to shift gears because I'm really interested to hear more about a couple other things that you've been involved with. So the first big one is that you are an ambassador for Natives Outdoors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, can you tell me more about that, what that is? And
So Natives Outdoors is an outdoor gear company. And so it was started over a year ago now by my friend Len Nessifer, who is a Navajo man. And it started off mostly actually as just a social media account, an Instagram account to show Native peoples recreating outdoors, because especially in the last few years, it's been pointed out that a lot of outdoor recreation isn't very representative of people that are of brown people, essentially, or people that might come from low-income communities, or that don't fit sort of this I don't know, whatever is perceived as like what an outdoors person is supposed to look like. So Natives Outdoors started as a way to highlight Native stories and photos of Indigenous people doing stuff outside, and it since then has morphed into a much bigger thing where now we actually sell outdoor gear. And so we sell things like hats and shirts, and the last few months, Len got it to be a public benefit corporation, where sort of part of the like mission of Natives Outdoors is to provide like a public benefit or public service. So one thing that we do is a percentage of the profits go back to Native-run nonprofits that work in cultural revitalization, outdoor recreation, or environmental issues. So part of the proceeds of what we sell is given back to Native communities. And then also we do things like hire Native artists to design the gear, or another component of Natives Outdoors is speaking at different events and to different companies and stuff that has to do with outdoors to provide an Indigenous perspective. So, for example, there's Outdoor Retailer, which is this huge, it's probably like the biggest outdoor gear convention in the United States. And so Natives Outdoors has a booth set up there. And one thing we've been asked by different either, companies or different groups, such as, for example, the Access Fund, which is a nonprofit that makes climbing areas accessible to climbers. Natives Outdoors has been invited to be at the table in conversations about land management, or for example, I was at a meeting where the Access Fund wants to start inserting Indigenous history into this website where you can find information on climbing, so that the public has a greater understanding that, hey, you think it's public land, but it's actually, it has a long Indigenous history, and Indigenous people still consider this land sacred. And so, be good stewards of it, and here's some information. So Natives Outdoors has really grown. And so I started out just as like a friend and a contributor to the Instagram account. And then I guess I should also say that I'm also ever since I moved to Arizona 3 years ago, I've begun rock climbing. I've also been a distance runner. I ran in college, track and cross country. And I continue to be a distance runner today. And I'm also like an avid hiker, nature photographer, I don't know, camper, whatever. So yeah, I was asked to be an ambassador, and I really believe in sort of the mission of Natives Outdoors to have more Native representation in the outdoor industry, and to, you know, share Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous histories.
Yeah, and these are sweet looking hats, by the way.
Yeah, those checker hats. Yeah, they're nice.
I'm looking at your website and I'm like, that is awesome. Or his website, I guess. Y'all's website. But yeah, I want one of those hats. Yeah, and that what you were just saying there, Lyle actually, so my co-host, he just was part of an article for Outdoor, I believe. And I'll put that in the show notes, where he was talking about a lot of that same thing, and the whole article was talking about basically how where we recreate are usually or often Native American sacred and culturally important places, and how to appropriately respond to that and be respectful. So that's a really great, interesting article. That check it out. It'll be in the show notes.
Well, that just made me think of something else. Is so another topic, research topic or thing I'm really interested is in, you know, cultural appropriation. And so actually the reason Natives Outdoors, another reason it was started is because we were encountering these issues of cultural appropriation in the outdoor industry. So one example is when I started climbing, I was looking to buy a chalk bag, and I was on Etsy, and I discovered this chalk bag that I loved. And so it turned out to be this small business owned by a woman, and I was like really ready to buy my chalk bag. And then I came across their website, and they had this line of products called the Navajo line or something. And yeah. And so I didn't think it was, you know, a Navajo owned company. And so I emailed them, and I was like, hey, I really like your gear. I'd love to support your company, but I wanted to make sure you guys had permission to use the Navajo name in selling your products. And I just did a little blurb of, you know, how it can be, you know, harmful to use tribal names, and how it's also just, you know, unethical to profit off of you know, a name that's not yours. And so they responded and didn't know like anything about issues of cultural appropriation. And they were like, oh, we just love Native American culture. That's why we wanted to call it the Navajo line. And that was like a red flag to me, because anyone, you know, that says that we love Native American culture, it's like, do you understand that there's more than 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States with like unique histories? And so anyways, one of the things that we've also been doing and have been able to sort of advise companies and places on is to think twice, and if you're going to use anything Native themed or Native named, because there's just a lot of instances of stories like that. And so since then, there's been changes. So that company in particular nixed the name of that line, which was really cool. And she was able to do that pretty quickly and was really open about once she heard, sort of, you know, without being angry to her or anything, but just kind of explaining where I was coming from as a Native Outdoors woman, that I wanted to address that topic, and she was really open to that. So that's another thing Natives Outdoors has I've seen made changes and is sort of making people think about, why they use native names or native imagery or whatever it be.
Yeah, and if people are looking for more guidance on that or something that they can just like physically send to somebody if they get in a situation like that, there is a guide put together by Simon Fraser University, their Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage.
Okay.
And it's called Think Before You Appropriate, a Guide for Creators and Designers.
Okay.
So it's a PDF. I'll put that in the show notes. And like, so if anyone finds, like runs into a similar situation where it's like, that's, this line is called Navajo and that girl is clearly not Navajo. They can directly send the PDF like attached to what you already sent. And, that person has like more that they can dive in further if they're looking.
That's amazing. Because I literally just had someone, as a person that uses social media to speak out about cultural appropriation and stuff like that on my Facebook and on my Instagram, I have individuals come to me with specific questions like, am I appropriating by doing this or using this image? And so that's a great resource that I'm excited to look at and send to people that ask me these questions. So
Yeah, exactly. It looks like it's like 21 pages. So and it's got like little images. Yeah, it's great.
Cool.
So
awesome.
Yeah. And that website too, they have all kinds of really cool, really interesting stuff on intellectual property rights. And, they have like podcasts and videos and all kinds of links. So it's just a great resource in general. But
awesome.
Anyway. Okay. So one question that I have, and this is more just something that I've been thinking about lately and talking to people about lately, is so there's a lot of talk about recreation as preservation. Basically that if people don't appreciate something and they don't use it, that they're not going to fight for it. But at the, on the other hand of things, there is also like damage done by recreation. So, like if we're talking about climbing, there's like physically things going into the rock. There's, like if you're hiking out to archaeology sites, like, like there is a physical damage that's part of recreation. So how do you balance those two? Or like what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's why I've written some public pieces and used my social media to advocate for monuments such as Bears Ears, where you have tribal leaders that, are co-managing a monument to, so you get that indigenous perspective on how to best manage the land. And then, so like, for example, Bears Ears is dear to my heart because I am an Indigenous woman, and so I feel like I understand deeply Southwestern tribes' connection to that area. So from an Indigenous perspective, it's really important. Cultural landscape has a lot of history and then also a lot of contemporary use for contemporary tribal people. I'm also an archaeologist, and there's so many archaeological resources within the original boundaries of Bears Ears National Monument. So like that in itself is important. And then I've been climbing for a few years now. And so it's also, Bears Ears is a huge climbing mecca for traditional climbers to climb cracks. And so it's really this monument. And then also growing up partially in Utah, it's like this monument that basically speaks to so many of my passions. So yeah, I really like, I like how, when President Obama originally designated it, you had these indigenous land managers and public land managers. And then you had like climbing also was going to be included in the management plan. And so I think when it comes to recreating and recreating responsibly, it really has to do with collaborating and consultation with all of the stakeholder groups and seeing what is important to preserve and how to best do that, and gaining as many different perspectives as possible and talking to the knowledgeable people on how to best do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, listening to those people because you know, in that article that Lyle's part of, they talk about Devil's Tower, and I'm sorry, Emily told me the indigenous or the Lakota name for that, and I don't remember it off the top of my head, so sorry, Emily. But that basically they it was like something to do with bear. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's gonna bother me. Yeah,
Bear's Lodge, right?
Yeah, Bear's Lodge. Thank you. And they were saying that basically when they first enacted the voluntary ban, that there was a lot fewer people that still climbed than today. Yeah. So like over this period of I don't know exactly how long, but not that long, basically the numbers of people who are choosing to still climb in June have really, really gone up, which is really just disheartening to see.
It is disheartening to see. And I was happy that, so yeah, you're right. Climbing is growing in popularity, and outdoor recreation overall has been trending lately, and more people are getting involved, which comes with good and bad. And so, but yeah, in the case of Bear's Lodge, I've heard too, that more people are choosing to climb during the month of June when there's this voluntary ban. And I was happy to see the at the beginning of June, when the voluntary ban went into effect, that the Access Fund put out a thing. And so the Access Fund, is primarily a climbers organization, but they put out a statement. And even though they were one of the original groups that were fighting essentially against tribes, against the voluntary ban, now through the last couple years, they issued this statement asking climbers to please respect that ban. And I was just really happy to see that, because like how there's been controversy between and historically between indigenous people and archaeologists, historically there's been controversy between climbers and indigenous people, where Native people ask for our sacred monuments to be respected, and in the past a lot of climbers have not done that. So I think there's changes, and I really hope that that climbers are open and, yes, like you said, listen to Native people and actually respect what they're saying, and not just listen but take action. So
right. And it looks like I found their statement, so we'll include that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I guess let's close out with one more question, which basically you have done a lot of, not just public archaeology, because what you're talking about with Natives Outdoors, it's not archaeology, but it's very much a public education. And then what you did for AmeriCorps. And so you've done a lot of public education, I guess, in various different forms.
Yeah.
So why basically, why is that such a focus? What is so important there? What are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I started my PhD program at University of Arizona with the intention of becoming a professor of American Indian Studies. And the reason I am so passionate about Indigenous studies, or American Indian Studies, Native American Studies, is because I really believe that sharing Indigenous perspectives of history and contemporary issues will help non-Native people better understand tribes, and then tribes will be will have more support and more public support in doing the things they need to do to thrive in today's world. And so I am a PhD student, but I also consider myself a photographer and a writer. And I use, I guess Instagram would be my biggest platform to write on not just archaeology, but on Indigenous history of land and in contemporary Indigenous issues like Bears Ears, and then like a couple years ago, Standing Rock, and these things, just because there needs to be a change in public education, and Native people are finally, like, I feel like we're able to, like, we're past the genocide, we're past the boarding school era, past the termination era for now, and so and it's finally like, okay, now we can make a voice for ourselves and share our stories. And I truly believe that there's like good people, and once they out there, non-Native people, and once they hear, reasoning of why maybe Bears Ears is so sacred to Southwestern tribes, or they hear why Standing Rock was such a big deal, once they have a more complete understanding, tribes are better enabled to create change, better change for our communities. So I really enjoy sharing what I've learned, and then writing on those things. And I personally, like, I get messages from people all the time, especially when I write on Indigenous issues, of thank you for sharing. I had no idea that this was going on. I really appreciate your perspective. How do I learn more? How do I support whatever it is? And so I think that speaking out on Native issues and Native history does make a difference, and it does make people understand, and therefore, and then people are more willing to see tribal perspectives and help tribes out. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll include, you wrote a article on an opinion piece on Bears Ears for the AAAs, and we'll include that, or yeah, it was AAAs. Yes. Yep. AAAs. Sorry. Yep. We'll include that in the show notes. And then also, do you want to let everybody know your Instagram account?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to understand for non-natives, I feel like, but it's Ash. So my name is Ashleigh, so ASH, Ash, Anishinaabe. So then the handle is Ash Anishinaabe. And then we'll include that in the show notes so you can spell it. Yeah.
Yes. And it's beautiful. Like, I'm not on Instagram, but it makes me want to be on Instagram because it's just stunningly beautiful pictures.
Thanks.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us today. And look forward to talking to you again maybe in the future.
Great. Miigwech, it was an honor to be asked to be on this podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Heritage Voices podcast. You can find show notes at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Heritage Voices. Please subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or the Google Music Store. Also, if you like the show, please share with your friends or write us a review. If you have any questions, comments, or show suggestions, please reach out to me at jessica@livingheritageanthropology.org, or you can find me on Facebook through Living Heritage Anthropology, or on Twitter @LivingHeritageA. As always, thank you to Lyle Belenqua and Jason Nez for their collaboration on our incredible logo.
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly